Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's Schiller Institute webcast featuring our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. In the last couple of weeks, Helga has spoken about the potential for a backfire as a result of the Skripal affair that Theresa May and her somewhat unhinged Foreign Minister Boris Johnson have been using as a way of attacking both Russia and the United States. Now, we've seen this play out in a very big way over the last couple of days. The fact that they came out in their own name, in the name of their intelligence services and their government to attack Russia has in fact put egg on their faces, as some have said. So Helga, why don't you catch us up on what's happened in the last days, because this is quite significant in terms of shaping these strategic relationships.
Yeah, I think it is incredibly serious because, well, now you have a situation where I think the whole group of nations which committed themselves to sort of, unprincipled solidarity with May and Johnson, I mean, they really have to reflect what has actually happened. So just to mention some of the recent developments, the head of the research lab, Porton Down, Gary Aitkenhead, came actually out and said that they could not find any proof that the origin of this nerve gas was Russia, that they could establish that it was Novichok or belonging to the group of Novichoks, but that they could not say that it came from Russia. Now, this has led to, quite a series of events. One was that the Foreign Office removed a tweet in which they had said very clearly that there was no doubt that the origin was Russia. And I think they even mentioned that the scientists of the Porton Down lab would have said so. So they felt obliged to remove the tweet because, that also is the evidence that Boris Johnson was lying, because he had said that he had heard from the scientists that there was absolutely unrefutable proof that this came from Russia. So this is the first thing. Then the London Times had a comment about this, where they say that the statement by Aitkenhead is threatening to bring down the international coalition against Russia. Well, that's indeed the case, because now naturally everybody is reviewing this. And, I think in the case of the German government, for example, they made a press conference afterwards in which, recently, in which journalists were asking, did this statement mean that you changed your perspective? And they basically refused to do so, which shows you really the absolute grip in which these people are, namely the grip of the British Empire. So I think this is now backfiring very clearly. The role of the British government and the British Empire, for that matter, is completely exposed. But obviously, they are not, stopping the confrontation with Russia, so that some of the Russian responses, for example, people speaking at the 7th Moscow Conference of International Security Matters, which is just taking place in Moscow, Narishkin, who is the head of foreign intelligence of Russia, I think, he said that this is, basically as serious as the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. So others were saying, this time these idiots went way beyond any line, and that is clearly the case. But you also have a whole series of people who say, look, we cannot continue like that. We have to resume a dialogue with Russia. We have to go back to straighten out the relation. And I want to really point to the fact that despite the fact that naturally the United States expelled 60 diplomats, Russian diplomats, which is clearly part of this escalation, that President Trump himself did not at one point use this incident to attack Russia as the origin. And I think this stands clearly out. And people who always are totally freaked out about Trump, they should really review this and say, is their perspective and their optical approach actually the correct one? Because in many cases, it turns out that Trump is actually the one who is not going for confrontation. And some of the people who are so much for democracy and human rights that they can't even, walk straight because they are so heavy burdened with their responsibilities, that they are the actual warmongers. So I think this is really something to reflect about. But I think the kind of procedure that NATO, half of the European Union, the German, the French government, they were all immediately jumping on this without evidence, condemning Russia. And I think this is, if you look at it, when the whole dust settles down, it is a blow to the whole Western system, because, if there is not, an establishment of scientific fact first, and the condemnation first, so that basically Russia is declared guilty, and then you find maybe the evidence sometimes down the road or not. I think this is a big damage to the Western system, because, if you play with these things lightly, I think it is contributing to the discreditation of the governments who did that, and that is not a good thing.
Well, minimally, we could say this is a rush to judgment, but more importantly, this is a part of an established pattern of British intelligence. We've seen it with the repeated charges without evidence that the Assad government was using chemical weapons against his population. And of course, the famous case of Tony Blair and Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be another fabrication of the highest levels of British intelligence. But there's another aspect of this that I think you may want to comment on, which is the case of David Kelly, because this also hits at home where there was opposition from within the scientific community in the United Kingdom against the actions of the government and the intelligence community.
Yeah, this is clearly a pattern. And, before the statement by the head of the Porton Down Lab came out, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Greg Murray, had actually said that he had from high-level sources from the intelligence community or the science community that the scientists would not basically produce the evidence, and they didn't. And David Kelly, at the time of the Iraq War, had basically blown the whistle, saying that there was no weapons of mass destruction. And then he found an early death under extremely dubious circumstances, which was then named to be a suicide. But nobody really believes that. So I think this is really something. If you think that the Iraq War was based on lies, and I think Willy Wimmer, the former vice president of the OSCE and former state secretary of defense, pointed to the fact that the Iraq War, after all, has caused hundreds of thousands of people to die in Europe, in the Middle East, in Northern Africa. And that the Chilcot Commission, which, from our standpoint was a relative cover-up, but nevertheless pointed to the fact that Tony Blair had willfully, intentionally exaggerated the danger coming from Iraq at the time and Saddam Hussein. And, then Colin Powell used the dodgy dossier of the MI6 from that period to argue for the US joining into the Iraq War. The fact that governments can do these things, which causes really, if you look at the totality of these wars, millions of people's lives, and then it just goes by and, there is no accountability. And, it's a complete hypocrisy and duplicity when, the people who are saying that they are the defenders of human rights and democracy then go around and do these interventions in sovereign countries, which has these horrible results. and then they are self-righteous and pretend that they are the good ones, and the Russians and the Chinese are the bad ones. I think we need to have really a review of this, because this cannot continue. It is very dangerous to world peace.
Well, and another aspect of this is that this was a major feature of President Trump's campaign, his election campaign in 2016, where he, at a very important debate in South Carolina, openly accused George W. Bush of lying to create the Iraq War. And he said that his administration would oppose these kinds of wars. Now, this week, the president announced that he's preparing to remove U.S. troops from Syria, despite demands from some in the military and the CIA that the U.S. remain in Syria. Helga, this is a fairly significant departure from the standard Bush-Obama policy of pursuing these wars, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And, again, you can see certain representatives of the U.S. military and others who say, no, we still have a lot of fighting to do against ISIS. But Trump, I think, is clearly sticking to his guns, and he has promised to stop the interventionist wars. And I think he is going a very far way to do so, especially if you consider that in the middle of this whole hysteria, he telephoned with President Putin and has reiterated that he wants to have a summit with Putin in the near-time future. And he was also meeting with the 3 presidents of the Baltic countries, who, as everybody knows, are extremely anti-Russian. And he reiterated that to have a good relationship with Russia is a good thing and not a bad thing. So I think people should really review their slanders, or their believing to the slanders against both Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping, because it comes from the same circle. It comes from the neoliberal geopolitical faction who are seeing that their system is clearly in bad shape, and who are obviously stopping short of nothing if you look at this recent affair.
And you mentioned earlier the Moscow Security Conference. Clearly, there's a discussion going on there about something that your husband, Lyndon LaRouche, brought up many, many years ago, and that you've been calling for, which is the establishment of a new security architecture. How is this proceeding in Moscow? Do you have some reports on what the discussion process has been there?
I think it's an extremely important event. There are 95 countries represented, 840 guests, 700 media. And obviously, this alone speaks to the fact that Russia is very far from being isolated, what some people in the West are trying to portray. So the meetings, the discussions were very focused on the need to have an international alliance to combat terrorism. There was a warning by the head of the FSB that there are signs that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are merging. And he basically said that this means that you will have sleepers and cells in every country around the globe. And the only way how you can defend against that is to work together internationally. Now, another very important aspect of this conference was that the defense minister of China went to this conference and made a statement that this was meant as a signal to the West that the Russian and the Chinese military are extremely in a close strategic partnership, and that this is meant as a signal to the West. So I think, the only way how, there were many warnings also, as I mentioned already, that, the present confrontation is approaching the danger of a Cuban Missile Crisis. So people are obviously extremely attuned to what is coming there from the British and their allies. But on the other side, I think, it also shows who is talking in favor of international solidarity, cooperation, who is addressing the real dangers of the world. It is clearly not the West, but it is clearly Russia, China, and the countries who are participating in this conference. And again, this is really something people should reflect about rather than believing the propaganda. If you read Bild Zeitung this morning on page 2, they have a picture of Putin, Erdogan, and Rouhani, and they say this is the axis of evil. I mean, this is ridiculous, I mean, these three countries have collaborated to bring about a solution to the terrible crisis in Syria. And, this is a very good thing. Now, not all aspects of the policies of these countries I would always subscribe. I mean, there's the unresolved tensions between the Kurds and Erdogan, between Turkey and Greece. So not everything is perfect, but I think on the larger picture, if you think that, the misery of the Syrian people who have war for 7 years because of the intervention of these countries, and not to forget the cooperation between US and Russian military under the leadership of Trump and Putin, I think people should not just fall for these propaganda lines because, there is some people who have to suffer with their lives and their livelihood and their happiness as a result of these policies. And for Syria, this is a good thing.
Well, especially this should have meaning for people in Europe because in 2015, 2016, there was the explosion of the refugee crisis. And with all the hand-wringing and crocodile tears that were shed, nothing was done to support the Russian intervention to stop the war in Syria. And I think the fact that the Russians, the Iranians, and the Turkish government were meeting to discuss this is something that should be welcomed as opposed to a source for criticism. Now, on the Russia-Turkey cooperation, there was another aspect to it because when you deal with these problems in the real world, there's always an economic element. And there was just an agreement between President Putin and Erdogan to move ahead with nuclear energy development. Helga, this is part of the broader package of the New Silk Road and economic cooperation that you've been talking about, isn't it?
Yes, I think the remarks of President Putin, who was at the opening ceremony of this nuclear plant, was to emphasize the extreme importance of nuclear energy, giving a country cheap and secure energy, and leading to an increase in the productivity of the entire economy, which is absolutely the case. And you have the many projects, Russia, China, India, having with developing countries in the building of nuclear energy in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So soon, countries like Germany will be the only ones who will not have nuclear energy. And if they keep this course, they will be completely sidelined at the disadvantage of the population. So I think this is really something we should change.
Now, the other story that's getting a lot of coverage internationally, and I think it's being covered typically by the media as a way of trying to drum up war, is this whole argument that the discussion and negotiations underway between the US and China on tariff policy is nothing but a trade war. Now, there's a danger to this, as the Chinese have pointed out, but I think it's important for people to hear your perspective on this, because obviously there are problems between the US-China relationship, a huge trade imbalance, but it's not just a trade war. There's actually a much broader discussion underway. So how do you see this evolving from what you've seen over the last few days?
Well, I think that, there is negotiations going on, and it must not necessarily come to the, execution of these tariffs, which both sides have now drawn up to the value of 60 billion in terms of products. I mean, one thing is that the Prime Minister Li Keqiang has pointed out that there is another way to overcome the trade imbalance, namely by increasing trade, by especially investments in joint ventures in third countries. that there are many ways how you can get rid of this trade balance. And there is a renewed discussion, something which we have brought into the discussion early on, namely that you have the possibility of Chinese investments in the infrastructure in the United States. And that would also be a way to completely change this dynamic. I mean, if the Chinese investment in American infrastructure would create many, many productive jobs for Americans, would create the infrastructure precondition for a real industrial revolution, for the building of new cities, science cities, connecting all American cities with fast train systems. I mean, there's so many ways of changing this dynamic to the better. And I'm absolutely convinced that that China is having this in mind. There was a program in the Chinese TV channel, CGTN, proposing exactly that. There should be a dialogue on infrastructure. Then you have some Americans, Trump supporter who had already made such a proposal early on also. So I think there is a discussion. And I would suggest, or I would imagine that President Xi Jinping, who will give a very important speech at the Asian Davos, as they call it, the BoJo forum, which will start in 3 days from now, where he is expected to make a major speech on the continuation of international reforms and opening up. So I think you can expect something important to come from there. And I think the Chinese are also extremely aware of the fact that we are sitting on a powder keg in terms of the financial system. Xi Jinping has made it has defined 3 priorities. One, to overcome the risks of the financial system, to alleviate poverty, and to get rid of air pollution. So I think the Chinese are very much aware of the dangers of this present Western financial system. And, you had several articles warning, that the outbreak of a new 2008 could happen at any moment. One of the many new aspects which were mentioned is the difference between the LIBOR rate and the Fed rate. And that was exactly the beginning sign of the 2008 crisis. So that really requires, that the discussion which we and our colleagues in the United States and in Europe have formulated to implement the 4 laws of Linden-LaRouche, Glass-Steagall, a national bank, a credit system, and then cooperation of the Western countries with the financial systems of the New Silk Road, the AIIB, the New Silk Road Fund. I mean, all of these things need urgently to be discussed, because one danger which is clearly there, that if you had now a financial crash, and some people are even speculating, that the same people who are doing these provocations against Russia could also trigger deliberately such a financial crash to pull the rug out underneath President Trump, to bring the neocons back in and get rid of this phenomena of Trump. So I think this is clearly, anybody who thinks this is conspiracy theory or thinks this is totally over the top, well, look at the Skripal case and, learn a lesson from that, how things can be manipulated and orchestrated. So I think the urgency is really to draw the lesson out of all of this and, end the system of looting, which is, only for the privilege of the very few rich. It's destroying the middle class. It's making the poor more poor. And we need really a return to Hamiltonian economics. This is what is the basis of the Chinese economic miracle. As I have said many times, the Chinese economic miracle or the Chinese economic model is much, much closer to the economic policies of the young Republic of America than people think. It's no coincidence that the distinction which Friedrich List, for example, made between the American system and the British system, that is exactly what is playing out today, and we need clearly a return to the American system of economy.
It's also important to keep in mind that President Trump has repeatedly referred to his great friendship with Xi Jinping, and the strategic importance of a China-US relationship is also clear when it comes to the question of the collaboration to bring a peaceful solution to the Korean Peninsula. There's a lot of diplomacy coming up, the Trump-Putin meeting, Trump meeting with Prime Minister Abe of Japan, and also the coming meeting with Kim Jong-un. So there's a lot more at stake here than just the question of a few dollars off the trade imbalance. And Helga, just to go back to one final point on the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm sure you took note of the importance of the visit recently of the Swiss government to China, and also a very large delegation heading to China from Austria. Maybe there's a lesson here for Germany, huh?
Well, one would hope so. I mean, I'm very happy because if all the neighbors of Germany are, clearly joining the Silk Road, it increases the pressure on those who are obviously too stupid or too arrogant to see the potential for German industry, which lies in this initiative. Now, the Swiss foreign minister was just in China, and he and his Chinese counterpart, both Wang Yi and also Yang Yishi, they declared that the collaboration of China and Switzerland in the new Silk Road is at the best historical level ever. And both emphasized the importance of Xi Jinping's visit last year to Switzerland, where he addressed Davos as a keynote speaker and then went to Geneva, emphasizing the importance of Switzerland. So they are deepening the relationship between China and Switzerland. And the Austrian government, they have a huge delegation, the largest ever. It is President van der Bellen, Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, 4 cabinet ministers, and 170 CEOs from large corporations spending 5 days in China. And what Kurz said is, he said, there is no limit to the top to improve the relationship between Austria and China on the new Silk Road. The same, by the way, is happening with Zimbabwe, where the new president is going with a large delegation of 12 ministers and also many, many CEOs. So I think, you can see almost every day a new breaking development. And as I have said many times, the spirit of the new Silk Road is, in my view, absolutely unstoppable, except if you have World War III, which obviously some people are risking. But nevertheless, I think the idea of a new relationship among nations, of respect for the sovereignty of the other nation, the respect for the difference of the social system, the ending of interventionist wars, the idea of a win-win cooperation, this is just a new model of international relations and a new paradigm. And the biggest problem is that because of the Western media being so much in control of this geopolitical faction, that most people don't know enough about it. So please, I would appeal to you, join the Schiller Institute, help us to spread the knowledge about the new Silk Road and also the options to solve the present financial crisis and many other crises around the world with such an approach. So I would really appeal to you, don't sit on the fence. This is an incredibly important historical moment. The British just suffered a terrible defeat, which freaks them out, but it's visible for everybody. And, so therefore it's a good moment to move forward and establish a completely different political, social, and economic system on this planet.
And we will be launching a new membership drive for the Schiller Institute. And I think if you want to increase the misery of the British intelligence establishment in the City of London, become a member of the Schiller Institute and help us build the audience for these webcasts so that people have an alternative to the lying media that otherwise is the only option they have to allegedly find out about the world. So Helga, I think that covers quite a bit. Thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, till next week.